All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our webinar, Using Onspring for Cyber Economic Risk Decisioning and Reporting. I'm Emily Elizabeth. I am Vice President here at Onspring. We are a no-code cloud-based GRC software. And with me today, I've got a special guest, Josh Reid from Crowe. He's a consulting firm. Josh has been in the GRC space for, I'm going to date you here, maybe 20 years. I'm not sure there isn't a scenario he hasn't tried to figure out and optimize for. And so today, Josh is actually going to take us through a couple of new ideas that his team has been kicking around inside Onspring. And he's also going to talk about some of the new SEC regulations that are going live at the end of this year and how your organization should probably start thinking through what you need to do about them. So what they mean for your organization, how you respond to them. So we are going to do a 30-minute discussion today. At the end of the 30 minutes, we'll pause and open it up for questions for everybody in the audience. So if you have a question, go ahead and drop it either in the chat or the Q&A that's in the top right-hand side of your screen. We are recording this. We will send out the recording after this so that everybody can share it with a friend, ask any questions. So with that, Josh, I'm going to let you take it away.
Okay. Thanks, Emily, and great to see everybody here on the webcast today. The topic that we're covering, as Emily mentioned, is something we've been talking about a lot this year with our clients, with different companies, around how to communicate cyber risk to business stakeholders, how to communicate to the board of directors, and also with the new SEC rules that Emily mentioned that go into effect actually next week. How do we understand materiality around cyber risk? And if we do have a cyber event, how do we determine materiality around that? So we're going to cover those different topics. And then at the end, we'll show just a very quick screenshot of how this information could also be presented in the Onspring GRC platform. So just a quick personal note. I grew up in Kansas, but I'm a big Chicago Cubs fan. Most of the people that live in Kansas are Kansas City Royals fans, but grew up in the 1980s watching the Cubs on WGN Network and just really fell in love with them. Have followed them ever since, and wanted to just give a very quick overview of the Cubs and to talk about how that relates to what we're going to talk about today. So the Chicago Cubs are owned by the Ricketts family. Joe Ricketts, who was the former CEO of TD Ameritrade, and his four children, Thomas, Pete, Todd, and Laura, are the majority stakeholders and board members of the Chicago Cubs. And so wanted to kind of set the stage here and just kind of talk about, what if we're all sitting in a room with the Ricketts family and Joe Ricketts asks the question, well, how is the team doing? How are the Cubs doing? And one of our team members in the room automatically jumps in and starts sharing all of these stats that you see on the screen here, talking about what happened yesterday, talking about earned run averages and how many hits the team had and things like that, where what Joe really wanted to understand as the chairman of the board are these three questions overall for his baseball team. What's our record? What's our standing in the division? Are we getting into the playoffs or not? That's a huge question every single year. And then what should we be focusing on for next season? And so that's the kind of information at a very high level that a board member typically wants to understand. So I did some quick research this morning to look how the Cubs were doing actually, and they are second in their division, 69 wins, 62 losses, 5 games behind first place, and there's about a month left in the regular baseball season. So within striking distance of making the playoffs for sure for the Cubs this year. But overall, that's the kind of information that a board member typically wants to understand for a baseball team. But how does that translate to a board member in the boardroom for your company that you work at today? And typically, as Emily mentioned, I've been in this space for about 20 years. 20 years ago, the chief information security officer was oftentimes not even invited to board meetings. But over time, obviously, information security has become extremely critical to an organization. We've seen over the last 20 years, obviously, the CISO is being invited to present the current state of the cybersecurity program, oftentimes either, if not semi-annually, oftentimes quarterly, that the CISO needs to present the information to the board. Where we've heard a lot of companies struggle is really connecting the technical cyber information into information that the board members would understand. And so we actually work closely with a company called X Analytics. SSIC is actually the name of the company. X Analytics is the tool. And they attended the NACD conference last fall, National Association of Corporate Directors. Over 20,000 members of the NACD. They had their annual conference last October. And the X Analytics team hosted and facilitated a workshop to really understand what do board members want to, what information do they want to be presented from the Chief Information Security Officer. And this screen here is just a piece of that report that came out of that workshop. But this definitely hits on the top areas that board members want to understand at a high level regarding their cyber security program. You can see the three main topics across the top. How well are we mitigating our cyber risk? Are we able to transfer any of our risk? And what is our overall risk appetite? So we're going to spend a little bit of time on this slide here just explaining this, and then that'll help talk a little bit more around these numbers and how we create these numbers for the board reporting. So on the mitigation side, obviously that first option there, that first row, current total expected loss, that's helping the board understand how much risk exposure we currently have out there. We could be susceptible to a lot of different scenarios, data breaches, ransomware attacks, and so forth. And we're going to talk a little bit more shortly about the breakdown of that potential loss. And then the next row down, what is our budget? So obviously the CISO is going to understand what their current year budget is. And then with that current budget, how much cyber risk have we mitigated so far? And so from this first column, we can show a couple of key data points. Number one, with our current budget, we're able to mitigate about 3.5 times the amount of risk that our company faces. However, we still have that $197 million still out there in potential loss. On the transfer side, this is really talking about your insurance. Cyber insurance is a huge topic that every company is facing today. And this is just a breakdown, again, just a sample example set of numbers here. But let's say our total cyber insurance limit is $45 million. We have a $5 million retention or deductible. And throughout this year, we could anticipate probably getting about a benefit of around $22 million based on any events that may happen. Then we may need to activate that particular policy. On the far right side, the appetite. So we know we have $197 million in expected loss, and we're probably going to get about $22 million of performance from our policy. That leaves us with $175 million in residual risk to the organization. However, the board and the C-suite will typically set that risk appetite level for the organization. And in this case, we're saying that the risk appetite is $100 million. That leaves us with a gap of $75 million of risk that's still out there. And so the big question is that after we walk through this with the board, what are our different levers that we can really pull? We could certainly allocate additional funding to the cybersecurity program to strengthen certain controls for the organization. We could buy more insurance, which is usually not a optimal choice. Most companies will not opt to do that a lot of times. Or we could raise our target threshold, whatever our appetite is. So usually it's going to could be a combination of all three of those options. mitigation, providing some additional funding and really targeting where to strengthen those controls is usually the most common course of action in that scenario. But hopefully this gives you an understanding of what the board members typically like to see. I was out at the ISACA GRC conference in Las Vegas last week and got to see another gentleman from Zurich Insurance present on board reporting around cyber risk. And it was interesting. He had a lot of very common concepts and things that he was showing that he has received feedback from board members as well. So these are the type of things that business leaders like to understand overall around cyber risk. So a lot of times, if you want to double click into that 197 million, what does that comprise? What are our real risks to the organization? That's going to vary quite a bit based on the industry that you're a part of, whether you're a financial services institution, maybe you're a healthcare organization, a manufacturing firm, whatever you might be. But usually you'll see the type of risk broken down a lot of times in alignment with your cybersecurity policy, frankly. And these are the four main categories that are typically presented. Number one is interruption, which could be maybe some kind of disaster recovery situation. Maybe a system went down. Maybe there was some kind of misconfiguration that took a system down. Ransomware is obviously in the news all the time. Same with data breaches. And then misappropriation of assets, which could be IP theft or fraud, funds embezzlement, those type of things as well. So a lot of times your board may have somebody that wants to double click into the specifics around what areas do we have the most cyber risk. And so being able to show that is certainly important. The next question typically comes up around, well, how material is this cyber risk to our company overall? That's a question that chief financial officers have to answer all the time when you talk about internal control over financial reporting. But how about from a cyber risk standpoint? And this is just providing an example of a company that is maybe about $10 billion in annual revenue. If there's total $175 million in risk that's out there, then that equates to about 1.8% of exposure based on our revenue. Free cash flow, it's about 8.8% of our free cash flow. And then our earnings, the bottom line, $750 million, 23% of earnings. So that's where that starts to get a lot of people's attention. If you do have numbers like this with your exposure, obviously when you have used your insurance, any remaining cost goes right to the bottom line for a cybersecurity event. And taking that out of your overall earnings can be impactful to the organization and impactful to how shareholders view the organization as well. So let's go on to the next slide here. Got a little bit of a delay. This whole concept of materiality has been coming up a lot the last several months, and the SEC, the new SEC cyber risk disclosure rules, have really been fueling that and creating a lot of questions for companies to help them understand, well, what does it mean for a cyber risk to be material to my organization? And if you look to the very letter of the law, essentially, so back in 1976, Justice Thurgood Marshall provided a Supreme Court majority opinion that basically says it's material if there's a substantial likelihood that a reasonable shareholder would consider it important in deciding how to vote, or maybe deciding whether to continue investing in your company. So it doesn't give specific numbers. Thurgood Marshall did not get into that detail. We have not seen the Security Exchange Commission give specific benchmarks or numbers that you need to consider for your organization. They really do leave it open to you to determine the reasonable level of materiality for your organization. And so it's important with that latitude to really work with your decision makers within the organization, with your chief financial officer, with your general counsel, your chief compliance officer, and really talk through, okay, what would be considered material from a cyber risk standpoint for our organization. And we have, we've put together just a very high level overview of the SEC cybersecurity risk management disclosure rules. And a lot of you may already be kind of working through your organization and talking about this. The rule was actually adopted about a month ago, July 26th. The purpose is really to help standardize disclosures of companies for their cyber risk strategy and their overall program, how they manage material cyber incidents. So as Emily mentioned, we are going to provide this PowerPoint. We've got some quick links in here to the SEC fact sheet and then the actual final ruling if you all want to take a look at that. But key points to understand here. Number one, as I mentioned earlier, this rule takes effect next Tuesday, September 5th. And you can kind of see some of the different key points to keep in mind on the 10K reports that are going to be coming out for your organization. You need to start putting some more specificity into the details of the 10K. So number one, the cybersecurity risk management program strategy and governance. How do you do that today? What's the actions and the activities from the board of directors and their oversight of cyber risk? And then lastly, what is management's role and expertise in assessing and managing material cyber risk? So there's that word material in there again. And from a timing standpoint, all registrants, all publicly traded companies need to disclose on an annual report if your report is coming out on or after December 15th, 2023. So that's an important date. It's coming up fast for a lot of companies. Some of you have already maybe been doing this and putting this level of detail in your annual report. But for those who have not, this is now what is being required in the new SEC rule. Also on the 8K, so the current report, if anything does happen in between now and your quarterly 10Q or your annual 10K, if you do have a cybersecurity event, you have time to research that to understand, is it material or not? Does it meet our thresholds that we've laid out as a company? So you do have time, but once you do determine that event is material, you have to report that on an 8K item 105 within 4 days of that determination, 4 business days, I should say. And as I mentioned, that goes on Form 8K item 105 for reporting. From a timing standpoint, this requirement takes effect for larger reporting companies on December 18th, 2023. If you're a smaller reporting company, you have some extra time. You've got till June 15, 2024 until you have to start reporting these material cyber events on your 8K. And as I mentioned earlier, talking through with the leadership, running through these different scenarios. We're going to talk more about this here shortly. How would we maybe do some walkthroughs around these different types of events that could happen to your organization? We often work with our clients to help them build impact matrices. And this is just a sample. Usually there's more categories that you're seeing across the top. But we do typically see a 5-point scale. This is something that if you look at the NIST 800-30, which is the guide for conducting risk assessments that a lot of companies use, they have a 5-point scale built into there from very high down to very low. And then it's just a matter of determining what are the different risk domains that are important for you to measure. And we typically don't recommend only focusing on the financial side. There's obviously other aspects of impact to the organization that should be considered as well, such as reputational, strategic, regulatory. A lot of companies will have safety or environmental, operational, those different categories as well. But this is just kind of a small example of a risk impact matrix that you might want to use for your organization. We're going to talk mostly here about the financial side. And this scale can, really vary based on the size of your company or the type of revenue that you generate for your organization. And so let's move on and kind of talk a little bit about how we could start to run some simulations to understand what would be considered material. Maybe that's very high. Anything that's 300 million and above impact would be considered material. Maybe it's a little lower than that. That's very much up to you and your organization to determine. As I mentioned earlier, that X Analytics tool created by SSIC is the name of the company. They provide a product that we work with, that we use with our clients to help really run through different simulations to understand what is material to an organization. And this is an example of a simulation within X Analytics. Let's say we wanted to understand at what point would we hit a material event if it was a data breach. And in this case here, we're showing a data breach that had 80 million records that were compromised. That would result in an impact of $233 million to our company. However, we have a $40 million insurance policy, which helps bring that down to a revised impact of $193 million. Again, for a data breach with 80 million records. Pretty extreme in that scenario. But let's go look at a ransomware attack as another example. Let's say we have a critical system. It's maybe our ERP system or something like that. Or maybe it's our website where we're generating a lot of revenue off of the website. And let's say we have a ransomware attack that brings us down for 24 hours total in this case. So we can click on this little drop down and choose the different levels of duration. In this case, 24 hours we're down with this particular system, creates this type of impact. We have this insurance coverage resulting in the final residual impact here. So being able to run through these tabletop walkthroughs with your leadership team really helps getting everybody on the same page to prepare for any time that may come your way over the next year. And you don't have to go into this level of detail, obviously, on your 10K, but it's important to have this type of process and these type of conversations with your leadership when those events do impact your organization. All right. So we've been talking a lot about the dollars, the numbers, the financial amounts, the cyber economics. And basically, cyber economics help you project what that financial impact is if you were to have a cyber event. So there's a lot of pieces that go into determining what those dollar amounts are. And we want to walk through some of those different components to help you understand what are those key criteria that you should consider to really understand those cyber economics. And the first thing is understanding your company overall, or what we call firmographics. The first piece around your firmographics are the revenue and earnings. So how much revenue do we generate overall? Are we able to break that down by country, where we have different countries of operation, different revenue being generated around the world potentially, or within certain regions? What's our breakdown of revenue based on the products and services that we bring to the market? Certainly important to understand that. The infrastructure that is supporting all of those processes internally and those products and services. So understanding the overall infrastructure, and then also what's our ability to recover revenue if we did have a certain event occur. All right, so certainly very important aspects there. Also talking about data. What type of data do we have within our organization? Again, by industry, that could vary quite a bit, whether you're a financial services institution or a healthcare organization, life sciences, whatever you might be. You're going to have different types of data that has different levels of value. You're also going to have different volumes of that data within your organization. And also intellectual property. Obviously, if you are a consumer products manufacturer, or if you are a pharmaceutical company, medical device, you have a lot of intellectual property that needs to be protected. What's the value behind that information? The volume metrics as well, total number of endpoints, employees, number of transactions, things like that. And then lastly, control maturity. So pretty much everybody on this call today, your organization has maybe gone through a recent cybersecurity risk assessment by a third party. That's something here at Crowe that we do for a lot of our clients, is helping them understand their overall cybersecurity maturity level, how they compare to different peers in their industry. You may have different certifications such as high trust and HIPAA, different SOC 2 reports, things like that. And a lot of this data actually can be also generated directly out of Onspring. So you may have GRC reports where you've done control testing for maybe SOX controls and things like that, that you have directly within Onspring. So those are some of the firmographics. And then the second piece is just really understanding what are all the different loss categories of things that could happen to our organization. And we've already talked through several of these, so I won't go into detail on them. But these are the four typical ones. Again, these are typically aligned with your cybersecurity insurance policy that you might already have in place. You have different sublimits that cover these different scenarios and things like that. So it's just important to kind of understand how those are categorized and monitored. So I talked about X Analytics just a little bit ago, and X Analytics is a tool that actually allows you to input all of that information that we just walked through, all of the firmographics about your company, your overall control maturity, and then it starts to bring in historical information of all those different loss types, the ransomwares and the data breaches and so forth, bringing in that historical information. And it allows you to really start to run through different scenarios. These what if scenarios can be used for those materiality thresholds to understand if it is a material event, as we showed earlier. You can also use the X Analytics tool to help understand what your budgeting should be for this next year. Where are we maybe weaker in certain cyber controls, and where can we get the most return on investment if we were to invest in maybe encryption technology or vulnerability scanning technology, whatever might create the most bang for the buck for that additional investment. And then also, where can we maybe pull some levers to maximize our overall insurance policy as well? So the X Analytics tool allows you to kind of run through these different simulations on the mitigation side and on the risk transfer side. And these are all the inputs that go into X Analytics. So there's actually close to, this is actually a little bit outdated. They've actually added several new sources over the last month or so. I think they're close to 100 different data sources, such as the Ponemon Institute, FBI, DOJ, a lot of government resources where they can bring in historical reported cyber events and the financial impact related to those events. They also bring in cyber insurance claim trends. They work with a lot of the cybersecurity underwriters that are out there that probably provide policies to you all on the call. So they provide the trending information around that. Also the firmographics we talked about, control maturity, and then your insurance information. So that all goes in to the X Analytics tool to really help understand those different scenarios that could potentially impact your organization. And so that's how you get those breakdowns. As we saw earlier, as we were going through the slides, you might have been asking yourself, well, where are these numbers even coming from? It's all based on historical data, historical events that have happened over the last 11 to 12 years across multiple industries, and allows you to break it down for your specific company to understand what that potential impact is. And then you can also determine your overall control focus areas. So based on your level of maturity, on the left-hand side, where could we invest a certain amount of money to really start to improve that maturity level? Maybe you use the NIST cybersecurity framework and you have a maturity level of a 2.5. You want to get that maturity from a 2.5 up to a 3.5 in a certain area. Well, how much investment would it take for us to really drive to that target that we're shooting for? So X Analytics really allows you to do those type of walkthroughs from a control investment standpoint. So we've been working with this tool with the X Analytics product for several years now, and it started to become more apparent that we could actually use that same information that X Analytics provides and bring that into the Onspring GRC platform. And we're going to walk through exactly how that could be done as we go through these next few set of slides. So the first thing is, most of you are probably using Onspring in this fashion where you have some kind of risk assessment that you're doing today. The example that we're showing here is using Onspring for an application risk assessment. So let's say we have an application that's in the Onspring system called a customer management system. And that customer management system has 500,000 PII records. So there's certain value attributed to that amount of PII records within that system. It's being hosted in Canada, and it's supporting our customer relations business unit. So that's kind of just a very basic risk profile of that particular application. And now we're going to use Onspring to do a application risk assessment. On that assessment, we have a question that most of you probably ask for all of your application assessments: is encryption enabled on this application? And let's say that application owner that's filling this assessment out says, no, we do not have encryption enabled. Well, that's the problem, right? That's something we need to do something about. So in Onspring, we're going to generate an issue. That issue gets automatically generated in the Onspring system. Due to some of the automation that Onspring provides, we can bring in that profile information, that risk profile information can be pulled down onto the issue. We can then decide, okay, this particular control, encryption is not enabled. That's part of our control framework, part of our control library. And if we go to the next slide here, you may be using Onspring today to have to manage your risk and control framework within the system. At Crowe, we have what's called a integrated cybersecurity framework, where we provide content of a library of risks and a library of controls. And what we've done is we've basically mapped the controls that we provide to those different threat types or loss types that are in X Analytics. So when an issue gets created, we say this issue is related to a particular control that is not implemented. And that control, if we go over to X Analytics, can help us understand this could result in a data breach, this could result in a ransomware attack, any of those different loss categories that we talked about earlier. And X Analytics will actually tell you, hey, if you don't have this control in place, it can result in X million dollars of exposure, and you have a certain percentage probability. We bring in the high, medium, and low probability levels where this control could be exploited if it's not mitigated. So we kind of do the behind the scenes of the mappings of controls to loss types, and then we can bring in the specific data from X Analytics to basically show you on the issue record what your probability and financial impact would be if this issue is not remediated. So that becomes a very different conversation from maybe how you're working with your application owners. Could be your third-party relationship managers too. You could be assessing third-party suppliers, doing third-party risk assessments in Onspring and generating those issues and being able to have those same type of conversations. Instead of a high, medium, low, red, yellow, green priority type of conversation, you're having actual financial dollar amount conversations. Some companies may say, well, where did you get those dollar amounts? There is that historical data. We provide kind of a summary of where this information is coming from, all those nearly 100 data sources over time to really generate those financial numbers that you can present to your business teams. So that's the overall framework that we've pulled together to help organizations use Onspring to do the cyber economic risk decisioning and reporting. Obviously, that information can be rolled up from an issue up to any related control. If I go back one level, that issue, there's obviously your controls are going to have more than one issue. So we can roll up the financial amounts to the control level, and the risks that you are monitoring and managing. A lot of times we'll have multiple controls in place to mitigate the risk. We can also roll up that information within Onspring at the risk level. This can also go up the business side as well. For an application, what's our total financial exposure for that one application? And then that can roll up to your business units and business processes as well. So these are the kind of conversations that you're able to have. And I'll just kind of show a couple of things that we've talked with our clients about, being able to position why it's important to maybe remediate a particular issue because there's a certain dollar amount behind that particular risk. And you can kind of see some of the examples there. What does this actually look like in Onspring? We're just going to go over real quick and take a sneak peek at this. And if you want to see a more detailed demo of this, we can certainly set up some time and walk you through this. But we've created what we call an accelerator in the Onspring system, where we've taken a lot of the Crowe knowledge on how to bring in the financial data, all the mappings, the risk and control content frameworks and things like that, and basically being able to show a lot of those things that we presented on that NACD board report. If you remember that the 231 million on that prior board report, that was the total cyber mitigation. And in this case here, we're showing we've mitigated as a cybersecurity organization $190 million in risk so far. And using Onspring, the nice drill down capabilities that are built in, we could click on that and see the list of all of the issues that have been remediated and the related dollar amounts for those particular issues. And then, of course, you can drill into the specific issue to see even more detail around that. If we go back to our homepage again, even though we've mitigated 190 million, we still have 156 million out there today. And this is basically a report that is bringing in the trailing 12 months over the past 12 months. So from August of 2022 to August of 2023, this is still the number of findings that are out there, open findings and related dollar amounts. We've also built in some capability where you can see just a quick snapshot of the monthly increase or decrease. And so what this is telling us is we've increased over the prior, so far for the month of August, our exposure has increased by $9.14 million, resulting in a 5.2% increase in our exposure. We've also built in some ratios. So business people love ratios. They love earnings per share. They love PE ratios, things like that. And so we built in some ratios around the cyber risk data as well. What this one is showing is how much risk have we mitigated versus how much exposure is still out there. So if we're at 1.0, we're basically treading water. We're not mitigating any more than additional exposure that's being identified through our assessment processes. With 1.25, that means that we are slightly mitigating more risk than exposure that's being identified. And then lastly, that whole materiality conversation, based on those thresholds you have, you may determine materiality as a percentage of revenue. Maybe it's 3%. And so in this case here, we're showing that $156 million of open exposure tied back to a $10 billion revenue company or whatever it might be, that's a 2.11% exposure. So we can kind of monitor from that standpoint too. And then of course, everybody loves line charts and trending. How are we trending across those different ratios? How are we trending with the open exposure month to month? So we can see we had a significant decrease over the past month here. And then, as I mentioned earlier, being able to roll up that financial information from the business side up to your business units and also up through your risk and control framework as well. So being able to see what are my top 10 risks from a financial exposure standpoint. These are just some of the sample risks that are in our Crowe CICF that we've built into here. And then some sample controls as well that we've built in. So a lot of ways to really slice and dice it. Once you get that financial data in there, again, backed by historical information that's being fed in on a monthly basis into the X Analytics tool, we can apply those financial concepts into your Onspring environment for better cyber risk decisioning. Emily, I know I went over a little bit of time here. But I will turn it over to you.
So fun facts. Okay. We didn't actually see Josh's screen while he was pushing all of those buttons. So here's what I'm going to offer. I'm going to offer up an hour of Josh's time for each individual on this call today to go through it in detail. So if you want to see, here's all the great reports and everything that Josh has built in Onspring, we can connect you guys and schedule an hour together so you can see here's specifically the type of trend reports, the type of analytics, the drill down features that you can get into when you're reporting something like this. So I'm going to offer that up. There's a couple ways to do it. I'll send everybody an email and you can reply back to me with, here are dates and times I'm free. Let's get on Josh's calendar. So that's one thing for everybody to know. Another comments have been going on in the chat around the reliability of the data that comes through when it comes to, hey, if you have this problem, this incident occurs, here's the actual financial loss you could expect. Mm-hmm. Can you just maybe talk through that data in a couple different ways? One, like where does it really come from? And two, how do you get people on board with trusting that where it's coming from is legit and you should be using those same data points to project financial loss?
Yeah, great question. Most companies will ask that as their very first question is, what's the reliability of that financial data? And the interesting approach that X Analytics took is, number one, they started working with one of the largest cybersecurity insurance underwriters on the market. Can't say their name, but if we have a private conversation, we could certainly talk more about that. But they basically started working with that cyber insurance underwriter, which that company, by the way, uses X Analytics to help with their decisioning on insurance limits and things like that. So that was their starting point. Instead of taking the X Analytics tool directly out to the market, they said, let's work first with the insurance companies and the brokers first to really nail this thing down. And so that's the first piece. The second one is those data sources are verifiable data sources, right? They're government organizations that bring in this information. They're organizational think tanks like the Pony Institute, things like that. So a lot of companies rely on that information. They go there manually to look at that. X Analytics is simply just bringing that into their platform to really pull that information together in one location. And I think the other thing that's important to note is there's a lot of variability. There's a lot of things that can kind of go into that, especially time. As more time evolves, there's more data that comes in. So the X Analytics tool is really designed to help you become more directionally aware of that financial amount. That number could change, obviously, over time, but it kind of gets you going in the right direction. And X Analytics actually has put together about a 4 or 5 page white paper that talks about what's under the hood, what's behind the scenes, of kind of bringing that financial data together.
Yeah. Do you think at any point in the future, companies will want to replace some of that data with like their own estimates or their own experiences?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that will happen. X Analytics does have some of that capability already where you can kind of manipulate that based on your specific experience. But the interesting thing as well is that they break it down across about 23 NICS codes. So manufacturing, financial, things like that. And they have a lot of data where you can actually compare your company and to other peers in your industry as well.
Interesting. Very interesting. So Josh, of all of the companies that you work with, maybe give a percentage here, like how many of them are actually prepared for the new rules that are going to go into effect here, I think you said in the next month in September.
Yeah. I think the percentage is high in terms of some companies. A lot of companies are already doing this at a very general level. If you look at a 10K for a company, most of them address cyber risk within their 10K already today. But the SEC is now requiring additional details around that, around your governance, around the oversight at the board level, around how the management team actually assesses and identifies risk. So that's some additional detail that's now going to have to be put on the 10K as well.
Yeah. So, okay. This is great. Thank you, Josh, for sharing all this. This was great. Everybody listening, thank you for tuning in. Recording coming your way. Send us some times you want to connect with Josh and see his screen so you can see everything that he was going to demo. So thank you, everybody. Have a great rest of your day.